Hello, everyone, and welcome to Brews and Bites. This episode is titled Storage Trends to be Thankful For. It is our Thanksgiving themed episode since next week is Thanksgiving. Before we start, I want to get some housekeeping items off the table. We have a number of attachments that cover the topics that we're going to discuss today attached. So just go ahead and download those at your convenience. If you have any questions throughout this, feel free to ask questions. We like to take a real informal approach, so we'll go ahead and answer them during the webinar since there will be no Q&A session at the end. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. So first, I think we have some familiar faces on Brews and Bites. If you're a Brews and Bites fan and if you watch the show often, we have Tony Barbagallo, a CEO, and T.W. Cook, head of engineering. So I'll let both of you introduce yourselves. So why don't you start, Tony, since you're CEO?
All right. Tony Barbagallo. I've been in the storage and IT industry for a long time, so I guess it's an appropriate subject to chat about. And while I do not have a beer in my beer mug, I am wearing a hat from our local brewery, but coffee for me since it's 11 a.m. in the morning.
Hi, I'm T.W. Cook. I'm the Vice President of Engineering and Services at Caringo. Been with the company for more than 10 years, so seen quite a bit of evolution in storage over that past decade. I too am sticking with coffee, so I've got a bit of a nice French roast here.
And I, of course, have my iced tea. I always drink tea again. I'm with Tony in California, so 11 a.m. Don't want to start too early. Maybe I'll start at 11:30 right after this episode. So the topic is storage trends to be thankful for. And first, let's just have a quick discussion on how storage has evolved. So, Caringo, we've been around for a while. Our first product hit the market in 2006. What have both of you seen since then? Not specifically at Caringo, but just in storage in general, the storage market. What's gone on in the last 15 years? So, TW, start with you.
Size and expectations are at the core of that. 10 years ago, a petabyte storage cluster was like an enormous big deal, and now it's like aren't we bothering with just a 1 petabyte cluster? The scale all the way up from drives, no one thought we'd be able to make spinning Rust drives that are as big as what we can get today. Density of servers, just the scale of storage has been enormous change over the past few years.
So, Tony, what have you seen?
Hard drives, SSDs, cloud, too much cloud, less cloud, hybrid, tiering to the cloud, but keeping it on site. So I think we're seeing, as TW points out, with the whole deluge of data and no one deleting anything and all the customer information that you can have and store and just data in general, it's really become too much information to store in any one place.
I think along with that comes just the access. We used to be able to store everything in file systems and just remember what folder you put it in. Once you get up to multiple petabytes, that really just isn't tractable anymore. Organizing into object storage protocols, using metadata to access it, access over the internet rather than local. All of those kind of come along for the ride.
So, let's go into the access a bit, because you mentioned a few things. You mentioned storage increasing, but from specifically from the access perspective, or I guess from the storage deficiency perspective, what have you been surprised at that hasn't changed? If capacity is increasing, what is a trend that maybe should have happened that hasn't been happening? So we'll start with you, Tony.
I'd say for those people still in file system land, I've talked to friends who've been involved, obviously, in the pandemic and in some different industries, and having to wait for someone to figure out how to install a VPN so that they can get remote access to their office data. And obviously, in an object storage environment that's native internet protocol access, that's taken care of for you.
Yeah, I think that remote access and the expectations that go with it are really a bigger deal than we sometimes think. But so many people have lost physical access to their offices. We've heard from some of our customers still can only go into their facility once a week. So the ability to access their data and to manage it, and to just the automation of all of that is critically important. Something fails and you can't go touch it. You really need to be able to depend on your storage system to fix it and protect your data until you can get there. And until you can get there might be weeks out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, before we go into kind of some stories on when organizations were thankful for storage, I mean, we mentioned file systems, and maybe if one of you or if both of you can just go into a little more detail on the why it isn't easy to access content via file system. I mean, Tony, you mentioned kind of how to do it with a VPN. I mean, there's other ways, but why when you get at a certain scale is it difficult to access data over or in a file system, or to access a file system in a distributed way? Maybe our viewers don't really know about that.
Sure, and I think that's, if you're talking about the information on your laptop, file system's just fine, obviously, because that's still the storage model that ships with everything personal. We're really talking about larger industries, unstructured data, files, video, patient records, personnel records. That kind of data is going to quickly saturate a file system. And then you're going to have, if you stick with that paradigm, you're going to need to have your IT staff silo the data, put it on different shares, different folders, and the like. So with that comes more complicated access. File systems are inherently limited. Of course, there's now distributed file systems that are out there, but they're still, at the end of the day, they're still file systems.
And with that comes data protection. So if you've got file systems, most expect you to, backing up, protecting that data is on you. So you need to backup utility or something. It's not, in most cases, it's not inherent in the storage system. The idea of replication or erasure coding or whatever.
Mm-hmm. And even with some of the new distributed file systems that are supporting that, again, there's still the notion of scale. How well does the storage environment, file system or otherwise, scale with the amount of data that you have? TW mentioned a petabyte way back when was huge. Now, those are probably our smaller installations.
That's the POC.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
So, but the other thing goes with that is just finding your data. I mean, in a file system world, the paradigm is the name of the file is how you find it. If you've got a storage system that supports rich metadata, you can find it in multiple ways. You could find it by patient ID number, any kind of metadata you chose to tag it with. You can look for geolocation, type, all kinds of things. I think that the other thing that people don't really appreciate on the scale side is just the challenges of keeping track of what's where. Mm-hmm. If the only way you've got is the path to the file.
So, I mean, you touched upon a number of things that are beneficial in object storage and our solution specifically. But so this is a good segue into why organizations have been thankful for storage. I mean, arguably this is a Caringo-centric show, so we're going to have Caringo-centric stories. But maybe if you want to walk us through a few of those, TW, where these organizations have been thankful to have a swarm or object storage specifically, and then we can have a discussion about those.
Sure. I think this year has brought some additional challenges. Talked earlier about access. The other thing, just about ability to scale. People that are trying to carry on business, need more capacity, and don't have the ability to go design some new system, a system that's expandable by just wheeling in some servers, is pretty important to people. We've seen a number of our customers who, despite lack of access, their need for storage and their access to their data has just gotten bigger and more challenging. People that can only go in, administrators can't go to the data center on demand. So what happens when a drive fails? So the idea that you don't really have to be thinking about that, where drive fails, the chassis fails, and knowing that, yeah, I can't go touch that right now, but it's okay because my data is protected. Everyone still has full access. There's a lot of thankfulness on the part of the administrators and users at not having to worry about that stuff very often, at having automation in the storage system. So I think I see that a lot from a lot of our customers. We have one multi-petabyte cluster, one of our customers. They have, I think, 40 servers, 450 drives. And it's an older cluster, so as drives get older, they fail more often, and they keep failing drives. They finally noticed that, well, 96 failed drives in this thing. Probably someone should go in and go RMA those drives and replace them. But the storage system had just seamlessly recovered the data elsewhere, rebalanced around them, and carried on. It's not an emergency when a drive or a chassis fails. It's just something you go put on your list to go deal with when you get around to it. I could argue that they waited maybe a little longer than, but they could do that. So not having to worry about that is I think a big thankfulness source.
Mm-hmm. So you said they had 96 failed drives out of about 450, 500?
Yeah.
So roughly over 20% of their drives had failed, and there was
that was over the course of a year. So no one had looked at this for a year.
Which I would like to point out, though, that we do let administrators know that it's not as if it's not as if a lack of trying on our part.
Yeah. We would be happy to alert them, and do every single time a drive fails. But they decided to ignore all that, not worry about it, and they can, as long as they've got enough capacity to recover. Everything will just work, and still did just work.
So thankful for automation, maintenance automation. I suspect that some of your other stories are going to be themed the same way, or they're going to have the same theme. Thankful for automated recovery.
Well, that's really one of the most important values that we have. And we had another customer that had a kind of an old school data center with Halon, and someone working on the Halon system managed to kill the air conditioner, dump the Halon, cause the room to be evacuated and locked down, and then no one could figure out how to get back into. So as things started burning up, by the time it was all done, the only thing that didn't have to be restored from off-site was their swarm storage system. Although they'd lost some hardware, it had gone and dutifully recovered and protected all their data. So they're probably thankful for that, although they're probably less thankful for whoever the guy that mismanaged the managed the hardware for them.
Yeah, definitely. The guy who set off the Halon system probably didn't have a very good day.
Probably not. I don't know what happened to that person, but certainly the people administering the storage and everything else were not very happy with them.
Yeah. And then you have another story about one of our customers.
Well, there's lots of them. One of the, I guess another aspect of this, we had a customer, been a customer for a long time, for probably close to 10 years, who started off with a cluster made out of those very low density pizza box servers. And that's not a bad strategy because the unit of failure is very small. You lose a whole chassis. It's, pretty small part of the cluster. But someone doing some math figured out how much they were paying for floor space for all of those low density servers and decided probably better do something about that. So they decided to take that cluster. Cluster is a backend for a very popular website, serving up all the images. So you can't just go shut it down, do a forklift or anything. So they gradually started wheeling in high density servers, adding them to the cluster, retiring out a pile of pizza boxes. And over the course of a few weeks, they'd done a complete hardware refresh to really a fairly different architecture without ever actually worrying about data migration or without shutting the cluster down. Now that was some years ago, they're on their third hardware refresh or finished it. So that cluster, each of the individual boxes has been down, but the cluster itself has been in continuous operation for years and years, even despite all of that sort of refresh. We have customers who do that a lot, who gradually, do a 3 or 4 year window on their hardware and roll out the old servers, roll in some new servers, and just gradually do a rolling migration constantly. And that's another thing to be thankful for. The alternative to that, moving petabytes of data onto some different storage system in order to do a hardware refresh is incredibly painful. Not having to do that.
Priceless.
Yeah, and I guess probably exactly priceless. I guess that's another way to look at it too. Like being thankful for the features and functionality, but taking a look at it from what they didn't have to do. And you mentioned downtime. They didn't have to go through site-wide downtime, which would have been an issue for them. Obviously, the other organization that had to deal with the Halon issue didn't have to go out and get an entirely new system, which is beneficial for them. And then what was your first story?
Just the remote administration and not being able to have physical access to your hardware or your data center. As Tony mentioned, we're moving into a world where access to the data over internet protocols is pretty straightforward, and we've come to expect that, not necessarily from the file system world, but from object storage. But the administrator side, people don't think about so much. Somebody's eventually got to go and RMA those drives that have failed, wheel in physically new servers if they need to add hardware capacity and things like that. And in a time when it's difficult to get physical access, or when it's remote, we've had other customers. We had a guy who lived in the San Francisco Bay Area and managed a cluster in Nevada, and would drive over there, once a month to go deal with stuff. But you can do that, and that's unique to pretty much to our way of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I guess it's a lot more important now than it was. I mean, we've always had these features that allowed for that delayed administration or the automated administration, but now those are definitely increasing in importance.
It's a bigger deal when you've got such a big cluster. I mean, really, statistically, drives fail at a fairly predictable rate. And if you've got hundreds and hundreds of drives, a drive's going to fail every few days. That's going to happen. And having that be an emergency is something you want to avoid. What you want to do is to be able to maybe not wait a year, but wait till there's enough to make it worth the trouble to go in and pull a few drives, swap them out. We've got one of our big customers today that's going through, and they're just hot plugging the drives out. So they've got half a dozen failed drives, pop them out. They're using it as an opportunity to increase capacity. So they're popping in bigger drives when they replace them. But the fact they can just go in and at their convenience and pull those drives out from a running server, pop a new one in, let hot plug mount it, Swarm will automatically detect it and do the right thing with it. Again, that's priceless compared to dealing with shutting something down and dealing with more traditional ways of updating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's not like in our world, there's no RAID rebuild or anything like that. In other systems, you can do that kind of a swap, but you're looking at decreased performance for a while or maybe downtime in order to rebuild everything on top of it. We don't have to do that.
Yeah, and you mentioned another trend when we were talking about in the prep for this show, all of the ransomware attacks that have been happening. So obviously, if an organization can help you with a ransomware episode or attack, you're going to be pretty thankful about that. So how does object storage and specifically Swarm help in those cases?
You got a couple of ways to approach that. One is you can just store things as immutable objects. A lot of our customers with really critical data, whether it's medical records or contracts or whatever, store them immutably so that the storage system will prevent them from being overwritten or modified in any way. So that's one choice you've got. The other thing you can do is you can enable versioning. So Swarm supports versioning inherent in the system. So you can ask the storage system to maintain the previous, however many previous versions you want of anything that when it gets modified. So if something did get modified in a ransomware attack, just restore the good version from last week or whatever. So there are some facilities under there you have to choose to use them. So you don't have to store things immutably. You don't have to turn on versioning, but there are some tools that that give you some really good protection that are pretty much transparent to you once you choose to use them.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people out there that wish that they'd done something like that. You see pretty frequent news articles about ransomware attacks in all kinds of places.
Yeah, definitely. And Tony, you were mentioning more kind of the external thankfulness for solutions like object storage, right? Some organizations kind of doing some current analysis of data.
Sure. I know the one of our customers, National Health Institute in Taiwan, I'm sure they're thankful for their comparatively very low numbers of coronavirus infections. And they are storing all of their patient data, patient records for every citizen in Taiwan in our solution. And I know, Adrian, I think you've talked to them and even the reseller there in even a little bit more detail. But I'm quite sure they're thankful for their low incidence of this.
Yeah, for them it was a centralization of all medical records, not just on Swarm, but on multiple storage devices, and being able to access that and compare the different records and see trends. Mm-hmm. So it has certainly helped them to keep the spread of COVID down in their country, which is.
I was going to say that kind of analysis is what happens when you remove storage silos.
And enable access, which we're talking about data access. So access is a pretty key component to their strategy.
And the other thing is if you properly use metadata, you can get at that data in a lot of different ways. Maybe look at for trends or things you didn't anticipate. So find things, slice things differently.
Yeah, I guess that brings us to the next question. Where's storage headed in the coming decade? So Tony, we'll start with you, then we'll go to you, TW. So where we talked about where we have been, kind of why people are thankful, but where do you see storage headed?
I mean, obviously there's faster tiers coming if they're not already here, NVMe over Fabric. So you're going to get higher and higher performance. Along with that, though, you're actually seeing the secondary tiers like object storage actually increase in performance with being able to do analysis with artificial intelligence and such. So clearly the performance of storage is increasing as one would expect. But also I believe that in terms of storage itself, we're going to stay in a hybrid world. I just don't think there's a be-all end-all answer to storing data on the cloud versus storing it in your data center. I think it's going to continue for most larger organizations to have some of that in the cloud, some of that on-prem, and who knows where else. Some of it's secure, some of it a little bit less secure. And again, so I think it's going to be key to play in that kind of environment going forward.
I think that that last part is really important. I think to sum it up, it's really about flexibility. Mm-hmm. People want to have the ability to put capacity wherever they need it. And you really see that in the trend of people re-architecting IT systems with Kubernetes, the idea to add capacity when you need it transiently. And to what that requires is the ability to access your data, to scale your data as you need it, and to manage persistence for all those things that are running transiently. So I think object storage really is a key player in the newer architectures of what people do. I think Tony's right that where you put that, you need the ability to put that where it makes sense for you from a business perspective. Sometimes you need to physically control that data, keep it on-prem. Sometimes you need it just close by for performance reasons. Sometimes you need to put it remotely. Certainly a lot of times you need to replicate it. We're seeing just more and more diversity in the way people use and deploy storage. So, ability to easily scale, to be resilient, to manage that data protection in that kind of a world is fundamental to that. Tony mentioned things like NVMe, that we're seeing more and more high performance in the storage, but also on the networks. in an object storage system like ours, the network is usually the bottleneck, not the media. And we have customers, scientific computing customers who are willing to invest in network and getting incredible performance out of object storage because they've thrown the hardware at it. So I think we're going to see object storage playing a bigger role in more high performance and more interesting places as the hardware enables that.
So we talk, I mean, Tony even mentioned, object storage is secondary storage. And, as we kind of move into this new distributed world, right? I think the one thing everyone can agree on is that we're now in a distributed world, distributed workflows. That's probably not going to change. I think, people will go back to work, will go back to the office eventually. But a lot of the distributed nature of the way people work will still be here. Yeah, I heard someone, it's not about working at home, it's about working from anywhere. That's kind of a good way to position it. So in this new distributed world, I mean, do we start thinking about object storage and distributed storage differently? I mean, is it going to be secondary, or maybe object storage is now primary because it's the best way to enable these distributed workflows? Yeah,
that's a great point. I think we've typically thought of our object storage as a better form of tape. And we would always refer to it as active archive, obviously, being able to go back to an archive and call up data without having to wait for a tape to be loaded or a tape library, et cetera. And if you look at a lot of the medical customers that we have, they're constantly having to go back to that, quote, active archive, because whenever a patient comes in, they want to look at past patient records. So it's actually, to your point, I think with this distributed nature that we've moved into, object storage is becoming less and less secondary storage and more really finding its home as storage for unstructured data. So storage for data that doesn't need a high performance transactional database to process it, or that doesn't need sophisticated editing algorithms, like video collaboration and things like that. But once the data has been manipulated and things have been done to it in that more high performance transactional based landscape, I think the sky's the limit for object storage and where it can be deployed.
Yeah, I think, TW, we were also talking about, the application becoming the main, user of storage. And in that world, it kind of fits straight into this new approach where, object storage really becomes a library or the catalog. It's not so much secondary storage or archive. It's the main repository that feeds maybe your faster performance storage, feeds, your different types of applications.
And I think people are we're already used to that mentality because that's the way it works on our phones. So, you rarely think about the file system in your phone. You just use an app and it stores stuff and it finds stuff for you. And as more and more things are built that way, then, file systems really become irrelevant. And the app is centric to that. And I think we're going to see that more and more in the enterprise as we go forward. But the other thing I think, Tony was heading toward is we're at the point now where for almost everything you do, except for transactional stuff like relational databases, object storage performance is good enough on modern hardware for almost everything you do. Mm-hmm. And people are starting to find out, and we have several customers who started off with that active archive idea and have started using, well, it's just easier to store our working stuff in there too, because it's fine. It's not enough slower that we can tell. And I think as people realize that where the performance of modern object storage has gotten to, and realize that it's really applicable to almost everything they do. So I think we're going to see more and more deployments like that, where people started off with active archive, and it's really easier to deal with that because you can search metadata and stuff. And why not just use that all the time? Well, there's no reason, especially if you can do it on-prem. So on-prem object storage can have really high performance out of it. And you don't have to move stuff over the wire. I think it's going to be attractive for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. And they're getting economies of scale because they're using those standard x86 servers that they started with their initial use case, and now it just add some more, increase the cluster. Don't worry about silos and files and folders and drive letters.
Yeah, and along with that, in our system, they can choose whatever level of data protection they care about. So they don't have to worry about backing that stuff up anymore, and you don't have to worry about moving it to that archive. You just go work on stuff, design the rules to protect it however you feel is appropriate. In our world, they can make decisions like protect it this way for the first 90 days, and if nobody's touched it for a while, go, reduce the footprint. There's really better flexibility on protecting your stuff by getting rid of those silos.
Mm-hmm.
What silo it's in, because that governed what protection it got. Now you can protect everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a lot of great resources to cover a lot of the concepts that we've talked about in our resources section on Caringo.com. So if anyone is interested in some of the topics or some of what we discussed, we usually have a webinar about it, a few different videos, possibly a paper. So as I mentioned, there's attachments attached to this webinar that go over kind of the smarts of Swarm and how we do certain elements of protection and erasure coding replication, a lot of what TW and Tony were talking about today. And we've already hit the half hour, the 30-minute mark, so we're going to start winding down here. And as we do on Brews and Bites, we often like to ask our guests if they have any words of wisdom for our viewers. It could be words of wisdom in life or words of wisdom relating to this particular topic. So why don't we start with you, TW, and then we'll end with you, Tony. So words of wisdom.
Don't wait a year to figure out how many failed drives you got.
We let them know, right? They didn't wait a year. They
let them know.
We let a year to replace.
But really, you should probably pay attention to that a little more often.
Yeah, exactly. Words of wisdom. Pay attention to your Caringo support staff. That's
there you
go. Tony, how about you?
The only thing I would say, keeping with the theme of this Brews and Bites, I wish everyone a safe and happy Thanksgiving and holiday season.
Indeed.
Yeah, Devin. Likewise, I think we all do. So from everyone at Caringo, I think I could speak for everyone at Caringo to all of our viewers and customers and partners who watch the show. Please have a safe and happy holiday season. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and conclude our Thanksgiving webinar. So thanks so much, Tony. Thank you, TW. Always fun.
Take care. Thank you, Adrian.
And thanks to viewers. Thank you. If you have any additional questions, feel free to email us at info@caringo.com. And you can also go to caringo.com and fill out a contact us form, and we'll get right back to you. And that's it. So guys, thank you very much.
All right. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.